Israel is now saying that they are preparing ceasefire talks with Lebanon as a gift to the incoming Trump administration. This is so striking in so many ways. I mean, first of all, just the utter callousness with which the political classes of our countries will play with human lives. I mean, in Lebanon, we're talking about 3,000 Lebanese who've been killed, about 70 Israelis who have been killed. I mean, notice the difference in those two numbers. Over 13,000 Lebanese have been injured, some of them terribly injured. You know, if you've been paying attention, you've seen the apartment complexes that have been leveled. All of this, for some political actors, is a game. It's a way for them to play power politics, which is pretty sick. You know, it reminds me of things that have happened before. And so I do think that there are things that are unique about the Trump-Netanyahu relationship. Clearly, Netanyahu was rooting against Biden, rooting for Trump. And here's another example of how they would love to help Trump politically. Meanwhile, Biden continues to support them despite getting no support in return, despite getting nothing to happen that he claims that he would like to have happen, like increasing aid to the Palestinians. Again, it's claims that he would like that to happen. And I think at this point, you have to read that for what it is. It's a PR stunt. But still, it's awfully callous that the Israelis would dangle ceasefire as a gift to Trump. But it goes back, you know, back in 1980, after Reagan was elected, and then he was inaugurated in January of 1981, literally 20 minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, the American hostages that had been taken in Iran were released. Now, there was some speculation at the time, but not very much, that perhaps the Reagan campaign had actually gotten involved with the Iranians and delayed the release of those American hostages, which was an enormous political issue at the time. And a lot of people, including Carter himself, think that that was an enormous factor in Jimmy Carter losing re-election in 1980.
A prominent Republican close to Ronald Reagan's campaign sought to sabotage then-President Jimmy Carter's re-election by asking Middle Eastern leaders to get a message to the Iranians: keep the American hostages until after the election, and the Reagan administration will give you a better deal.
Many figures in the Reagan campaign have come forward and said that they were part of these negotiations. It's not clear whether Reagan himself knew about it, but even the fact that the idea would have been entertained and that some members of the Reagan campaign, most notably his campaign advisor, would pursue something like this is pretty shocking. And I think a good reminder of exactly what the ethics of our political class can be, and often are. And while the question of whether Reagan negotiated to keep the hostages captive is somewhat up in the air, the evidence isn't 100% conclusive, although the testimony is pretty compelling from those who say they were involved. We do know that Nixon, the Nixon campaign, when it was running after LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, had said he was going to resign, said he wasn't going to run again for the presidency because of Vietnam, because the anger in Vietnam was so intense that Johnson decided he wasn't going to win re-election. In the run-up to that election, there were peace talks between North and South Vietnam. The United States, of course, was supporting South Vietnam against the North Vietnamese, and they were doing this to defend a partition of Vietnam that was illegal, that they had agreed to get rid of. They had agreed initially that there were, after a period of partition, there were going to be elections that included all the Vietnamese. But once it became clear that they would lose those elections to the North Vietnamese, to the big bad communists, they went back on that and they said, well, no, South Vietnam is going to remain a separate country. Well, there were peace negotiations that were going on between the Johnson administration, together with their South Vietnamese proxies, the North Vietnamese, and the Nixon campaign was afraid that that was going to tank their chances to beat the Democrats in the upcoming election. And so they actually got in touch with the South Vietnamese, the U.S. proxies, and said, don't do this. Don't agree to anything. We are going to give you a better deal when we get into office. Now think about that. You are talking about not only tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who could be killed in the intermediate period of time, but also U.S. soldiers on the ground who were being killed in very significant numbers, especially compared to the way that they're killed today with our techno wars, where they get to sit far from the action and kill at a distance. I mean, the morality is shocking. And this is clear without a doubt. We have tapes of LBJ calling the Nixon campaign, telling them this is treason.
Or some of our folks, including some of the old China lobby, are going to the Vietnamese embassy and saying, please notify the president that if he'll hold out to November the 2nd, they could get a better deal. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know.
So once again, we see the political classes have a really, truly monstrous morality. And I think a huge part of our politics has got to be calling them out, has got to be saying this is inhumane. This is not a humane way to lead the world and to insist on international law. It's an ongoing fight. The cravenness of the political classes just really knows no bounds. There's another aspect to this story, of course. I've always believed throughout this campaign that there are some potential silver linings to a Trump presidency. Now, I don't think it's because Trump's a good guy. I don't think it's because he has the right politics, although there are aspects of his isolationism that I admit appeal to me, because we so often get this very polite, very educated, very murderous foreign policy out of Washington, D.C. That's what's considered upstanding. If you can tolerate the deaths of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians without blinking an eye, that means you're real serious about foreign policy when you're in Washington, D.C. I mean, just go back to that footage of Madeleine Albright being asked about 500,000 Iraqi children.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
And they didn't even get rid of Saddam Hussein, because what Madeleine Albright was talking about were the sanctions that the Clinton administration imposed against Iraq. We're not even talking about the results of the invasion and the occupation of Iraq, the destruction of the government of that society that our political class decided to start less than a decade later. But there are potential silver linings to Trump being in office, and I think that this announcement of ceasefire talks is potentially one of them. Now, I think the announcement of ceasefire talks need to be taken for what they are. They're also a PR campaign, because the proposal that's being reported that the Israelis are putting forward basically is victory for the Israelis. They would basically get to control all flow of any kind of supplies to Hezbollah, cutting off supplies to Hezbollah, their enemy, and having control over a huge part of the border between Israel and Lebanon. The Lebanese prime minister has said that it's not acceptable, that it's an infringement on Lebanese sovereignty. So we'll see where that goes. And it's important to remember that this is a PR. We don't know that anything real is going to happen out of this. But there's also this thing, if we're looking for silver linings in the election, there's this thing that happens where we could say, only Nixon can go to China. Nixon had a real reputation for being a strong Cold Warrior. He was really anti-communist. And, you know, when he'd come into the presidency, he expanded the war in Vietnam. He expanded it into Cambodia. He was a bloodthirsty man. But Nixon decided to make peace with communist China. A pretty big deal back in the early 1970s. Very fresh in the historical memory of the people living then was the Korean War, where the Chinese troops had actually directly attacked American troops in South Korea. Now, of course, that was right on the border of China, whereas the United States was sending troops halfway around the world. But still, that was direct conflict between the Chinese and the United States. And then again in Vietnam, the Chinese were supporting U.S. enemies. And they were this big communist boogeyman, Mao Zedong.
The idea was Mao Zedong ate babies for breakfast, so to speak.
He was the chairman of the Communist Party. Well, Richard Nixon decided to go and make peace.
All nations will gain from a reduction of tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China.
And he said something that I think is right and I'm not sure if it's the way he meant it, but he said to Mao that those on the right can do what those on the left can only talk about. And Nixon had cover to be able to make peace with China because he had a reputation for being such a cold warrior. And that's maybe the silver lining that we can hope for out of Trump, that because the Republicans are seen as so bloodthirsty, as seen as so pro-Israel, that they have the political cover to make some kind of peace. But whatever happens, even if that's the case, the moral bankruptcy of the political classes is just incredible. And it didn't start with Trump. It's worth going back to these previous treasonous political efforts to see that. I think it's worth remembering this political history and just the atrocious moral bankruptcy of some of the actions that people have taken. And remember, we didn't know that these things were happening for decades afterward. What I describe about Nixon tanking the negotiations in Vietnam, we actually didn't know about that until quite recently. So, for 2 decades afterward. So keep in mind that our political class needs to be watched very closely, that they're often moral monsters.